Binding, the final step of a quilt that we're ready to get finished so that we can get going on that next project. Today we'll be going over how to figure the length and the width of the binding, connecting the sections of your binding to make one long piece, sewing the binding on, including easy corners, and then two options on sewing the ends of the binding together so that the connection will not be visible. Let's get started. When deciding on how wide of binding you want, a couple things to consider. Is your quilt going to be thicker with a heavier fabric for the binding? Do you want the binding to be a focal point on the quilt, or do you want it to blend in so you hardly even see it? Most of these quilts here start out at 2.5 or 3-inch binding. This one was a 3-inch. This one's 2.5, 2.5, and you can tell that because it's 3/8 inch finished, where this one started out at 3 inches, which gives it a 1/2 inch finished. I've sewed on a couple different sizes of binding so you can get an idea of what each one will look like. If this is your first time with binding, I would recommend doing a sample one to see which works best for your quilt. This one here is a 2.5 inch, so when it's folded over and then folded over to the back, it'll look like this. This one is 3 inch. And then this one here is a package of blanket binding, and it started out at 4 inches. Next is the length of your binding. This is a baby quilt. I have measured the sides. It is 29 inches by 42 inches, so to go all the way around the quilt is 142 inches. When figuring the length of the binding, I always add on several inches to the end so I have binding to work with when connecting the ends. Now when I say several inches, I like at least 10 inches. I know that it's going to get cut off, and so while it is not required, it sure will make the connection at the end easier. The binding that I'm going to be working on a lot of the time will be for this quilt. The binding that I got for the other baby blanket is just a purchased blanket binding. It's going to need to be trimmed down, and I'll show you that one too, but just so you don't think I'm putting some crazy blue fabric on a pink baby quilt, I'm not. This quilt will take a couple strips to go all the way around the quilt, so we'll need to connect them. If we connect it with just a straight seam, what's going to happen is to do your binding, it gets folded in half, then you sew it on, and then it gets folded and folded. So like right here, I have 6 layers of fabric that are going into the binding. When it comes to a seam, if I keep it in a straight seam across here, I will have 12 layers of fabric on top of my quilt, and that gets really thick and bulky. So your better option is a mitered seam. So your mitered seam is going to look like this when it's finished. So when you fold it in half, half the seam is down here and half the seam is up here. And that will really reduce the bulk, and an angle seam is much less noticeable. Let me give you a couple examples. On this border here, when you do a straight line across, when you stand back and look at your quilt, that straight line will really stick out. But when you do a miter on your border and on your binding, the seam is not nearly as noticeable. Of course, it's still there, but not as noticeable. Let me show you this one. You can see the stitches if I kind of pull it apart right there. I fussy cut them and mitered them together, and so then when you look at it, you don't see that seam. But if I had gone straight across, it'd be really hard to get everything lined up. Anyway, so I highly recommend miters whenever you're putting two pieces, especially of long fabric, together. To make a mitered seam, you took your 2 strips of fabric. On one end, I have this edge ironed down because that's where I'm going to be sewing. I place it on here, and your goal is to go corner to corner. So when I flip this over, it will look like this. So I open it up, and you can either iron or use a pencil to draw a line, whichever is easiest for you. Go ahead and pin here and here, and then sew. The first time I sew, quite often I'll use a longer stitch, even a basting stitch, then I'll open it up because it's super easy to get slightly off, and then you need to rip it and try again. Once you have it in the place that you want it, then I go back and do a solid seam. My machine automatically sets to 2.5, but if it's going to be on an open end seam, a lot of times I'll use 2.0 if I remember to switch it. Another thing to be careful of is if I sewed my seam this direction, when I opened it, my fabric would go that way and that way. It would not give me a long strip. So make sure you're sewing right corner to right corner to get you the long strip. And I know that out of experience. Then you trim off any excess fabric. You can use a rotary cutter or just a scissors, whichever. I always press my seams flat to set the seam. What it does is it pushes all your threads together in their right spots before you press it open. If you just press it open, a lot of times you'll lose the nice solid seam appearance, and you'll see your threads. Once you have all those made, you're going to come back and iron all of your fabric in half, just like this, and then your binding will be ready to go onto the quilt. So where do you start sewing the binding on? Look at your quilt as a whole. Generally, when people look at a quilt, they do so the same way they look at a sheet of paper, either top to bottom or a specific spot that is a center of attention. I usually choose somewhere down here on the left side or along the bottom. The only spot that you cannot choose is the very corner. What you're looking for is a 10-inch space that you can connect both ends of the binding without being too close to a corner. When sewing on binding, I like to use a walking foot. A regular presser foot stays stationary while sewing. A walking foot will move with the feed dogs. It will pick up the fabric and pull it backwards, both on the top and the bottom. It is not necessary to use the walking foot, but it does feed the many layers of the quilt through well. If you're doing a test, I recommend using a long stitch so you can easily take it out. The first thing that you're going to do is iron it flat like this to give it a nice edge. Then it's going to get folded around to the back. What your goal is the edge of your binding will line up with the seam that you just sewed. So it'll roll over and it'll line up exactly right. You don't want to have a gap in here, and you don't want to have too much fabric in there to make it a bubble. I'll show you a sample of that. So like this one here, so they're all different seam allowances. And if you notice right here, it is okay if you go off where you're supposed to, just stop, come back, and sew your seam where it should be. So this one here is obviously too small of a seam. So when I fold it over, this is where I want it to line up with, but it goes way over. So then you pull it back to where it should be, and what happens is you have this gap that you can feel in here. You want it to be one nice solid piece in there with no gap and no bunching. On this one here, when I sewed it on, I did not have a small enough seam allowance. So you can see right here, this is where my seam is, but this is where I fold it over to. So when I sew it, it's gonna either have a gap between the seam and the binding, or if I pull this all the way over, it'll bunch up here on the edge, and I don't want either of those. So I have two options. If I've sewn it all the way around my fabric and I really don't want to seam rip it out, I will just fold it back, take my rotary cutter, and slice off just a little bit to make it fit right. The other option, of course, is seam ripping, which is why I recommend doing a test strip so you can see if you're going to like it at the end. So this is what a nice finished one will look like. You fold it over, and it just matches up nicely. I don't pin it, but what I do is I pull these both tight and sew up to my hand. Alright, when you get down to your corner, what you're going to want to do is stop a seam allowance before the edge. So an easy way to find that is I take a pin and I kind of tuck it in on top here. This is where the edge of my fabric is. A lot of times your presser foot will match up. So I turn my fabric. Obviously I need to go a little bit farther. I think one more stitch should do it, or two. And there I am, right at the edge of where my pin is. So I'm going to do a back stitch here. Cut my thread, take it out of my machine, and then we're on to the corner. Don't let corners intimidate you. Before we get to the corner, what you always need to do is do a quick test. And I'm glad that I did, because what I found was when I pulled it here, brought it over to the back, I am way over the line. I have a gap here. So I will fix that and then I'll be right back. You do not need to do this on a cutting mat. I'm putting it here just for visual sake. So you have, I lined it up on my top and bottom line. This is a 45-degree angle. What you're going to do with your binding is fold it back at a 45-degree angle. So it goes from the corner down. Now, I also then am checking it on this side to make sure it is straight here. Then, sometimes if I want to, I'll press it or finger press it. Next step is to pull it straight down so that then it lines up at the top and on this side and this side. That's kind of what it looks like here. And so you can see that's where my seam ends, and that's right at that fold. So you want it to line up on all your sides. I'm going to show you one more time, just freehand. My seam ends a seam allowance away from the edge. I fold my binding up. I fold my binding down, lining up here and here. Throw a pin in it to stabilize it, and then sew on down the edge. Starting at the very back, I'm going to show you the corner one more time. This time I've used a pin. I've measured up my 5/8 of an inch for my seam allowance, and that's where my stitching will end. It is now time to join our binding. I have left about a 10-inch gap here, so I have room to work. The first option I'm going to show you is the easiest option, and it will suffice for most of your quilts. You're going to fold one side over at a 45-degree angle. Give it a light pressing here, so you know where to sew your seam. This one then comes over. I pull it just a little bit tighter than what you think it should be, just a hair. Pin it. And so you see how I've already pulled up on this gap? The reason I leave so much gap here is so that I have room to work with it, room to put it under my machine. Now I flip it over and sew corner to corner right here. I pinned it on that side. I prefer to have my pins on the side that I'm sewing. Also would like my pins going across the seam where I'm going to sew. So I'm going to repin it, keeping the other ones in there, and then go ahead and pull those out. All right, let's see what it looks like. So when I turn it over, it's going to have one seam at an angle right there. Normally the next step would be to trim the excess, iron it, finish sewing the seam across, and then you could iron it down like this. I would like to show you another option, so I'm going to go ahead and rip this seam out. The main difference between the two binding options that I'm showing you is the simpler one, when you put them together like this, will have an outside seam, so that when it gets folded over to the back, this seam allowance here, you're going to want to kind of tuck in so that it doesn't show and stick out. The next option for binding is you're going to open it up and you're going to make a 45-degree fold, just like on the other one, except for the full width of the binding. You're going to press this one open as well, so you get your seam line, so you know where you're going to sew at. Then what you're going to do is close it back up, pull it tight, and then you need to mark where the two are going to get sewn together. What happens if you try to have this open, the only way to get it open is if you bunch it up back here. Well, then that's not tight with your quilt. So go ahead, close that, pull it up here, bring this one over, and I just use an ink pen because it's in the seam allowance, and I mark right where I want that corner to be. Pencil, whatever you have on hand. Then I go ahead and bunch up the bottom, and I'll know that when I open these two up here, my mark lines up with down there. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this. And then I'm going to flip it over because this is the actual side that I'm sewing on. So I'm going to have it go all the way up to there. And I'll go ahead and put several pins in here to hold it in place. The first time I do this seam, I will also use a longer stitch, because what I have found is that it is such an awkward seam that it's easy to get it off the first time around. I'm just going to make sure my line mark lines up from here. And that was Lola the cat. All right. I'm going to make my seam length 5.0 versus 2.5. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this a little bit of a test to see how it lays. For the most part it's okay, but I did not do my rule that I do every time, is make it just a little bit smaller than what the marking is. So I shall do it again. All right, take number 2. So I want to make sure it is really a true 45-degree angle. And I'm going to press it again. And I think actually not only am I going to press it, but I am going to put a pin in here just to mark that for safety's sake. Bring it out here. Straighten out my quilt. So if I was just going to line it up, this is where I would line it up, and look at that, I was way off last time. That's why I use a basting stitch. So, and I guess it wasn't too far off if I stretch it out. But what I know is that I want it moved over from that a good 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to go ahead and open this up and repin it. I'm going to go in 1/4 of an inch from my first seam. Flatten it out as best I can. All right, let's try this again. And something didn't go right, but it's okay, it's a basting stitch. Kind of stretch that out there. And then let's see how it lays. All right, that is what I want it to look like. So it just lays nice and smooth here. So my seam is going to be both on the inside. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to give this a final stitch across in a normal sized stitch, probably 2.0 or 2.5. Then I'm going to trim this edge off. I'm going to iron it nice and flat, and then come back and stitch across here. All right, I put my new seam in there. I trimmed it. Now I'm going to press the seam to set the seam. Then I will go ahead make sure my seam is going the same direction there, that it looks nice, it lays flat. There we go. I've sewed this seam here. My next step is to go around the quilt and iron the binding to go towards the outside. And then after that, I'm going to have to decide how I want to attach it on the back. I'll show you a couple of options and you can decide what you'd like your quilt to look like. When attaching the binding to the back of your quilt, you have two options, hand sew or machine sew. These three here were all hand sewed on. It's a nice clean look. These three quilts were sewn on with the curvy machine stitch. These two quilts here, the binding is finished with a blanket stitch. Out of all the stitches, This one, it really does look nice, but it is a challenge to get it to be lined up exactly in your seam allowance on both sides. So hand stitching takes the longest. This is the most challenging to make look accurate. The curvy one is, I think, just a super simple one to use on a lot of quilts, and a lot of times I'll use that for my quilting as well, so it will match in with that. But your machine has lots of decorative stitches. It's good to give them all a test. This quilt I've decided to hand sew. To keep your binding in place, you have several options. You can use stick pins, you could use bobby pins, you could use some pretty purchased pins. These are clips or a smaller clip. But I will be honest, my favorite is basting. I baste my edge, and then as I hand sew, I rip it out. I usually rip it out about an inch or two before I hand sew. No matter how you finish your binding, you're going to want to have nice looking corners. You're going to fold your fabric over. On this side, I try to cut off just the hair of that point to help the fabric not get too bulky there. You're going to fold it in, and you're going to fold it in on this side. You want a nice 45-degree angle up there. And that is what you want it to look like. A trick to having it lay flat is, if you notice, this side goes over here, but then this side comes over here. So my extra fabric fold is switched on both sides. If I brought this side over on both sides, as you can see there, it gets really bulky over here where there's nothing there. So if you have your fabric fold on this side, then you want your fabric to have that extra fold on the opposite side. This was one of my favorite quilts to make. It is called the His and Hers Quilt. This is Darren's side of the quilt, and this is my side. Since each side of the quilt has a completely different look, a binding that matches each side was hard to find. So here's a solution for you: a two-sided binding. Here's a close-up of the binding. This is the His side, this is the Hers side, and so there's actually a seam right here that's pretty hard to see that puts the two pieces together. A good size for a finished width of this binding is a total of 3 inches. Since you're cutting it in half, you have to add on a 1/2 inch of extra seam allowance, a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch here. One piece is going to be 1 1/4 inches. The other piece will be 2 1/4 inches, making it a total of 3 1/2 before you sew. But once you sew, put these two pieces together, it'll turn it to 3. So you're really going to need to think about which one goes where, and I'll show you how it looks after they're sewn together now. I've sewn the two seams together. I've pressed it flat, then I've also pressed it in half. I'm going to sew it onto some batting so you can see what it will look like when it's on a quilt. When you sew it on, you want the 1 inch strip on the bottom, the 2 inch strip that is what you see. You sew it on a 1/2 inch in, then when you fold it over, it'll look like this, and then you fold it over one more time, and it will look like this. And then sew it down to your quilt on this side, whichever way you choose, and you'll have a two-sided binding. Thank you for watching this video. I really hope that it helps you out so that you can move on to your next project. If you have a question or a suggestion for another video, or would like help figuring something out with your binding, go ahead and message me.